History has always been fascinated not only with the rise of kings, but also with the manner of their fall. A crown may sparkle with divine authority, but it cannot shield a man from the cruelties of fate. Thrones have been lost on the battlefield, in the council chamber, in prisons, and in the streets. Some rulers died peacefully in their beds, surrounded by loyal kin and priests whispering prayers. But others met an end so violent, so humiliating, and so drenched in tragedy that their final hours became as famous as their reigns. These stories endure because they are not merely about politics or power. They are about the most human of themes: betrayal, suffering, and the way death strips away all pretense, leaving even kings naked before eternity. When we recall the most tragic royal deaths, 5 stand out above all others. Each belonged to a man who once commanded nations, yet whose final moments were defined not by glory but by misery. Their stories span centuries and continents. They unfold in castles, on battlefields, in crowded city squares, and in dark prison cells. Together, they reveal the fragility of earthly majesty. Number 5. Richard III of England. Let us begin with Richard III of England, whose very name has become a byword for ambition, villainy, and betrayal. He lived in an age of endless civil war, where the crown of England passed from hand to hand in rivers of blood. Richard seized that crown in ruthless fashion, but the hand of fate and the swords of his enemies struck him down in a death so brutal, so humiliating, that his dynasty vanished in the mud of Bosworth Field. Richard III was born in the year 1452, the youngest surviving son of Richard, Duke of York, and Cecily Neville. His childhood was not one of peace and comfort, but of war and danger. The Wars of the Roses had engulfed England, pitting the rival houses of Lancaster and York against each other in a merciless struggle for the throne. Young Richard grew up in the shadow of death. His father and elder brother were slain at the Battle of Wakefield when Richard was only 8 years old. From that moment, survival itself became a lesson he learned daily. When his elder brother Edward seized the throne in 1461, becoming Edward IV, Richard's fortunes soared. Edward was a towering warrior king, bold and charismatic. Richard, smaller and less imposing, nevertheless earned his brother's trust. He served loyally in battle, commanding troops in the bloody skirmishes of the civil wars. Chroniclers praised his courage and his determination. Though his enemies later painted him as twisted in body and soul, the reality is more complex. Richard was intelligent, disciplined, and utterly devoted to his family's cause. Yet ambition grew inside him. He watched how fragile crowns could be. He saw men rise to greatness only to fall beneath the axe. He knew that to secure power in England was to seize it without hesitation. That moment came in 1483, when his brother Edward IV died suddenly. The crown was meant for Edward's young son, a boy of 12, who would reign as Edward V. Richard was appointed protector, entrusted with guiding the boy until he came of age. But Richard had no intention of remaining in the shadows. He declared that the boy and his younger brother were illegitimate, citing a supposed pre-contract of marriage that invalidated their parents' union. The princes were taken to the Tower of London, supposedly for their safety. They never emerged. Whispers swept the kingdom that Richard had arranged their murder. Whether he did so remains one of history's enduring mysteries, but the suspicion was enough. Richard took the crown for himself. His reign began under a cloud of blood. The people were uneasy. Many nobles doubted him. Enemies gathered in exile, rallying around a distant Lancastrian claimant, Henry Tudor. Henry had little claim to the throne by blood, but he possessed ambition, and more importantly, he possessed allies. In the summer of 1485, he landed in Wales with an army and marched east. The two forces met on August 22nd at Bosworth Field, a battle that would decide the fate of England. Richard rose at dawn that day, knowing that the crown of England hung in the balance. He donned his armor, mounted his horse, and led his men onto the field. He may have been haunted by suspicion, but on that morning, he showed the courage of a soldier. The fighting raged for hours. At one point, Richard saw Henry Tudor across the field, vulnerable and exposed. Seizing the moment, he spurred his horse forward, leading a desperate charge to cut Henry down and end the rebellion with his own sword. For a moment, it worked. Richard carved his way through enemy soldiers, striking down Henry's standard-bearer. He came within yards of Henry himself. Had fortune tilted a fraction, history might remember Richard as the victor who crushed the Tudors. But fate is cruel. His horse became trapped in a patch of marshy ground. At that same moment, the powerful Stanley family, who had promised their support but hesitated until the last moment, betrayed Richard. They threw their forces behind Henry Tudor. Richard found himself surrounded, isolated, abandoned. Still he fought. Chroniclers, even hostile ones, admit that he fought with desperate bravery. He swung his sword wildly, striking blows until his arms grew heavy, but the tide was too great. Blades crashed down upon him. Archaeological evidence uncovered in 2012, when his skeleton was discovered beneath a car park in Leicester, tells us the grim details. He suffered at least 11 wounds, 9 of them to the head. His helmet had been torn away or lost, leaving him exposed. Swords sliced into his skull. A halberd split bone at the base of his head. Daggers pierced through the side of his face. He was overwhelmed, butchered where he stood, fighting to the last breath. And yet, even in death, his humiliation was not complete. His naked body was stripped, slung across a horse, and paraded into Leicester. Crowds jeered at the fallen king. His corpse was displayed publicly, proof that the so-called tyrant was gone. Then he was dumped into a hastily dug grave, his hands bound, his body forgotten. For centuries, his bones lay under the soil, buried beneath buildings and streets, until chance revealed them 500 years later. The tragedy of Richard III is not only in the violence of his death, but in the destruction of his legacy. He died, abandoned by allies, betrayed by nobles, reviled by subjects. The House of York was extinguished with him. Henry Tudor seized the crown as Henry VII, founding the Tudor dynasty that would rule England for the next century. Shakespeare, writing more than 100 years later, immortalized Richard as a monster crooked in body and soul, a villain who schemed his way to power and met fitting doom. The truth is more complicated, but the myth became reality in the minds of generations. What remains undeniable is this: Richard III, King of England, died not with the dignity of a monarch, but in the mud of a battlefield, hacked to death by common soldiers, his corpse paraded and forgotten. His was a death both brutal and symbolic, the end of an age, the end of a dynasty, and the beginning of Tudor rule. Among the tragic deaths of kings, his stands as one of the most violent, the most humiliating, and the most unforgettable. Number 4. King Charles I of England. Among all the monarchs of Britain, none met an end more shocking, more symbolic, and more tragic than King Charles I. His death was not on the battlefield, not in exile, and not at the hand of an assassin. He was executed by his own people, in full public view, his head struck from his body by the cold steel of an executioner's axe. It was a moment that stunned Europe and shattered centuries of belief in the divine right of kings. Charles was born in the year 1600, the second son of James VI of Scotland, who would later become James I of England and Anne of Denmark. As a child, Charles was frail and sickly. He struggled with a stammer and was overshadowed by his older brother Henry, who seemed destined for greatness. But when Henry died suddenly of illness at the age of 18, the shy, awkward younger son became heir to 3 kingdoms. In 1625, upon the death of his father, Charles ascended the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. He inherited a realm rich in history, but troubled by division. The Protestant Reformation had reshaped Europe, and in England, religious suspicion simmered constantly. When Charles married Henrietta Maria of France, a Catholic princess, he confirmed the fears of many Protestants who saw in him a king who might return England to Rome. The young queen was beautiful and spirited, but she clashed with Parliament and was deeply unpopular. Charles himself was dignified, formal, and deeply convinced of the sacred nature of kingship. More than any monarch before him, he believed in the doctrine of the divine right of kings, the belief that monarchs were chosen by God and accountable to no earthly authority. To him, to question the king was to question God himself. This conviction gave him strength, but it also blinded him to the storm that was gathering. His early reign was marked by conflict with Parliament. Charles sought money for wars against Spain and France, but Parliament resisted, demanding oversight of royal spending. When they refused, Charles dissolved Parliament and ruled without them for 11 years. To raise funds, he revived old taxes, fined landowners, and imposed unpopular levies. To him, these were simply the rights of a king. To his subjects, they were tyranny. Meanwhile, Charles's policies in religion caused further outrage. He supported Archbishop William Laud, who sought to impose uniformity in worship and revive rituals that many Protestants saw as dangerously close to Catholicism. Opposition hardened, especially in Scotland, where Charles attempted to enforce the Anglican prayer book. The Scots rebelled in fury, and Charles found himself at war with his northern kingdom. To fight, he needed money. To get money, he had to recall Parliament. But Parliament was no longer willing to bow to the crown. Instead, they demanded reforms, stripping the king of powers he had taken for granted. Charles resisted. Tensions mounted, and in 1642, the quarrel erupted into open war. The English Civil War tore the kingdom apart. On one side stood the royalists, cavaliers loyal to their king, proud of their aristocratic heritage and their belief in monarchy. On the other stood the parliamentarians, the Roundheads, led by figures like Oliver Cromwell, determined to assert the supremacy of Parliament over the crown. The war was brutal. Families were divided, towns destroyed, and fields soaked in blood. Charles himself proved brave in the field. He rode at the head of his troops, calm and composed under fire. But he was not a great strategist. His armies suffered defeat after defeat. By 1646, he was captured. Though he escaped and reignited the war, his cause was doomed. The Second Civil War ended swiftly, and his enemies determined that England could never be safe while he lived. And so came the unthinkable. In 1649, Charles was put on trial for treason against his own people. The King of England, descendant of centuries of monarchs, stood before a court created by Parliament, accused of being a tyrant and a murderer. To Charles, the trial was absurd. "I am your king, your lawful king," he declared. He refused to plead, insisting that no court of subjects could judge their sovereign, but his defiance only sealed his fate. The verdict was certain. He was condemned to die. On the morning of January 30th, 1649, London was silent under a heavy sky. Crowds gathered along the streets, held back by ranks of soldiers. Outside the banqueting house in Whitehall, a scaffold draped in black had been built. Soldiers lined the square. The air was thick with dread. Around 2 in the afternoon, Charles emerged from the palace. He wore 2 linen shirts beneath his cloak to guard against the cold, so that no shiver would be mistaken for fear. He walked calmly onto the scaffold, looked out at the sea of faces, and addressed those within earshot. He declared his innocence, insisting that he died as a faithful man of the Church of England, betrayed by rebels who had overstepped their station. His words carried dignity, even a kind of majesty. Those near enough to hear were struck by his composure. Then came the final moment. Charles removed his cloak, handed his possessions to the bishop who attended him, and knelt before the block. He tucked his hair beneath a white cap so that it would not obstruct the blade. He stretched out his arms as a signal. The executioner raised the axe. With one swift, powerful stroke, the head of the king was severed from his body. A groan rose from the crowd, a sound of shock and awe. The executioner held the bleeding head aloft and cried out, "Behold the head of a traitor!" Drums rolled. Soldiers stood rigid, and the people of England had witnessed the impossible. Their king destroyed by their own hands. The news spread across Europe like wildfire. Monarchs shuddered. If the English could kill their king, then no crown was safe. In France, Spain, and the German states, rulers trembled at the precedent. In England, Parliament abolished the monarchy and declared the nation a republic under Oliver Cromwell. The world had changed forever, yet the execution did not bring peace. Instead, it left a wound on the soul of England. For royalists, Charles was a martyr, a saintly figure who died with courage and dignity. For parliamentarians, he was a tyrant rightly punished. But for all, his death was unforgettable. It was the end of an era, the collapse of the belief that kings were untouchable. The tragedy of Charles's death lies in its symbolism. He was not struck down in battle, like Richard III. He was not betrayed by foreign enemies, like Darius of Persia. He was executed by his own people, in cold blood, in a ritual of destruction meant to erase the very idea of monarchy. He believed to his last breath that he was God's anointed sovereign. But the axe proved that even a king could be judged, condemned, and destroyed by men. In later years, when the monarchy was restored under his son Charles II, the image of Charles I was remade. The church declared him a martyr. Prayers were written in his name. Paintings depicted him as calm, serene, and saintly at the scaffold. But no image could soften the truth. His death was deliberate, public, and tragic beyond measure. Charles met his end with dignity, but his fate remains one of the most sorrowful of any monarch. He was a man trapped by conviction, unable to bend, and so he broke. His death is a reminder that the crown, though adorned with jewels, cannot protect its wearer from the judgment of history or from the axe that waits when people decide that majesty is no longer sacred. Number 3. King Darius III of Persia. The tale of Darius III is the tale of the end of an empire. He was called the King of Kings, ruler of the vast Persian realm, heir to the legacy of Cyrus the Great and Xerxes. His empire stretched from the mountains of India to the coasts of Asia Minor, from the deserts of Egypt to the fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. It was the largest, wealthiest, and most powerful state of the ancient world. But by the time Darius took the throne in the late 4th century before Christ, Persia's greatness was already fading. Its kings had grown weak. Its nobles had become corrupt. Its armies, once feared across continents, were undisciplined and divided. Into this decaying world stepped a young Macedonian conqueror named Alexander, who would become known as the Great, and between them unfolded one of the most dramatic clashes of antiquity, ending in betrayal, humiliation, and the tragic death of a king. Darius was not born to greatness. His rise to the throne came not through heroism or military achievement, but through palace intrigue. Sources suggest that he was elevated by powerful courtiers after the assassination of King Arses, the weak son of Artaxerxes III. Darius was related to the royal family, but only distantly. His authority depended on the support of ambitious nobles who expected to use him as a puppet. He wore the title, King of Kings, but his grasp on power was fragile from the beginning. When news came that Alexander of Macedon had crossed into Asia Minor with a small but disciplined army, Darius at first dismissed the threat. To him, Alexander was a boy, barely out of his teens, leading a band of Greeks who had long been subjects of Persia. But Alexander moved with speed and genius. He crushed the Persian satraps at the Battle of the Granicus, opening the gates of Asia Minor. Alarm spread through the empire. Suddenly, Darius realized that his throne was in peril. Determined to destroy the invader, Darius raised a vast army. At Issus, in 333 before Christ, the two forces met. The Persian host dwarfed Alexander's troops. Darius rode in a magnificent chariot, surrounded by bodyguards, his banners proclaiming him King of Kings. But numbers meant nothing against Alexander's brilliance. With a bold maneuver, Alexander led his cavalry straight at Darius himself. The Persian lines buckled. Panic spread, and in a moment that would haunt him forever, Darius turned and fled. He abandoned his chariot, his weapons, and most shamefully his own family. His wife, mother, and daughters fell into Alexander's hands. To the Persians, this was disgrace beyond measure. A king was meant to die before fleeing. To abandon family was unthinkable. Yet Darius lived and tried to recover. He offered peace to Alexander, even offering half his kingdom as ransom for his family. Alexander refused. He did not want half the empire. He wanted all of it. 2 years later, at Gaugamela, Darius assembled another massive army. Ancient writers claim it numbered in the hundreds of thousands, drawn from every corner of the empire. Cavalry from Bactria, archers from Armenia, war elephants from India, scythed chariots meant to slice through enemy lines. The battlefield was prepared, leveled to give advantage to the chariots. Darius once again took his place in the center, radiant in royal robes, confident that sheer numbers would crush Alexander. But once again, Alexander's genius prevailed. With a daring charge, he split the Persian lines and drove directly toward Darius. The King of Kings, seeing the Macedonian phalanx closing, lost his nerve. Fear overcame him. He turned his chariot and fled for a second time. The Persians, seeing their king depart, broke and scattered. The greatest army of the age was destroyed. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis fell into Alexander's hands. Darius was now a fugitive in his own empire. He fled eastward, seeking to raise yet another army. But his authority was gone. Many of his satraps and generals deserted him. His people no longer believed in his strength. In their eyes, he was no longer king of kings, but a man who ran from battle. Among those who betrayed him was Bessus, satrap of Bactria. At first he swore loyalty, but as Alexander closed in, Bessus plotted. If he could seize Darius, he might proclaim himself king and rally support. In the summer of 330 before Christ, as Darius retreated through the barren lands of modern-day Iran, Bessus and his conspirators struck. They seized the king, bound him, and placed him in a cart. No longer did he ride in a golden chariot, surrounded by guards. He was now a prisoner, jolting along the dusty road, abandoned by all but a few loyal attendants. As Alexander's forces pursued, Bessus made his decision. If Darius fell alive into Alexander's hands, the Macedonian would treat him with honor, and perhaps use him to legitimize his claim to the empire. But if Darius died, Bessus could present himself as his avenger. And so, in an act of treachery that shocked even the brutal world of antiquity, Bessus and his men stabbed the bound king, leaving him bleeding in the cart. They fled, leaving him to die alone. When Alexander's troops reached the scene, they found a pitiful sight. Darius, once king of kings, lay mortally wounded, his body pierced, his breath shallow. He was gasping, blood pooling around him. According to the historian Curtius, Darius used his final words to thank Alexander for the kindness he had shown his captured family. He begged Alexander to avenge him upon the traitors and to protect his mother, wife, and children. Then, in the dust of the road, far from his palaces, the last king of the Achaemenid dynasty died. Alexander, moved by pity and perhaps by admiration for the fallen king, ordered that Darius's body be treated with full honors. He sent it to Persepolis, where it was buried in the royal tombs with the rights of a monarch. But the empire was finished. With Darius's death, the Achaemenid dynasty ended. Persia, once the mightiest power on earth, became a jewel in the crown of Alexander the Great. The tragedy of Darius's death lies in its utter humiliation. He did not fall gloriously in battle, sword in hand, surrounded by loyal guards. He did not die in the majesty of a palace, with priests chanting prayers. He died bound in a cart, betrayed by his own men, bleeding out on the roadside like a common criminal. The King of Kings, heir to Cyrus and Xerxes, reduced to a broken fugitive, abandoned by those he trusted. His end reminds us that power is fragile. The greatest empire of the ancient world fell not only because of the brilliance of Alexander, but because of the weakness of a king who could not inspire loyalty. Betrayal came not from foreign enemies, but from within. The death of Darius III was the death of Persia's glory, the final chapter of a dynasty that once ruled the known world. Among the tragic deaths of kings, his stands out not only for its misery but for its symbolism, the collapse of an empire and the fall of a man who, in his last moments, could only pray that his conqueror would show more loyalty than his own men had done. Number 2. King Louis XVI of France. The death of King Louis XVI was not only the end of a monarch, but the death of an entire age. For centuries, France had been ruled by the Bourbon dynasty, kings who embodied the majesty of absolute monarchy. Their palaces shone with splendor, their courts dazzled with ceremony, and their word was law. But in the late 18th century, that world cracked and collapsed in fire. The French Revolution swept away centuries of tradition, and at its center stood the tragic figure of Louis XVI, a man neither cruel nor despotic, but indecisive and overwhelmed, caught between the old world and the new. His execution by guillotine in Paris was not simply the punishment of a king. It was the symbolic destruction of monarchy itself, one of the most shocking and tragic deaths in history. Louis was born in 1754, the grandson of King Louis XV. He was not raised to expect immediate power, and as a child, he was shy, awkward, and withdrawn. He loved hunting, reading, and working with his hands, especially with locks and keys, an odd hobby for a future king. When his father died unexpectedly, Louis became Dauphin, heir to the throne. At 20, he inherited the crown upon the death of his grandfather. The young king was unprepared for the vast weight of responsibility. France was in crisis. Decades of costly wars had drained the treasury. The 7 Years' War had ended in humiliation, with France losing much of its colonial empire. The American Revolution, which Louis had supported in order to weaken Britain, only added to the financial burden. The state staggered under crushing debt, and the people groaned beneath heavy taxes. Meanwhile, the nobility enjoyed vast privileges, exempt from many of the burdens that crushed the poor. Tension simmered like a storm waiting to break. Louis was not a man of action. He was gentle, soft-spoken, and uncertain. Unlike his great-grandfather Louis XIV, the Sun King who had embodied absolute majesty, Louis XVI lacked confidence. He was a man who wanted to do good, but who could never decide how. His queen, Marie Antoinette, became the lightning rod of public anger. Young, beautiful, and foreign, she was accused of extravagance at a time when bread was scarce. "Let them eat cake," a phrase she never spoke, became a symbol of royal indifference to suffering. As the financial crisis deepened, Louis summoned the Estates General in 1789, a meeting of representatives of the clergy, nobility, and commoners. It was the first time the body had met in over a century. Louis hoped to secure support for reforms. Instead, he unleashed revolution. The Third Estate, representing the commoners, declared itself the National Assembly and swore to create a new constitution. The Bastille fell, peasants rose in revolt, and the old order crumbled. Louis vacillated. He granted reforms, then retracted them. He accepted a constitutional monarchy, then plotted secretly to reverse it. In 1791, he attempted to flee Paris with his family, disguised in common clothes, hoping to reach loyal forces at the border. But he was recognized at Varennes and dragged back to the capital in disgrace. The flight to Varennes destroyed what little trust remained. The people no longer saw their king as a father of the nation. They saw him as a traitor conspiring with foreign enemies. By 1792, war raged across Europe as Austria and Prussia sought to crush the revolution. The monarchy was abolished. France was declared a republic. And Louis, once an absolute monarch, became simply citizen Capet, stripped of titles, a prisoner in his own capital. In December, he was put on trial before the National Convention. The charges were treason against the nation, conspiracy with foreign powers, and betrayal of the people. The trial was a spectacle. Louis defended himself with dignity, insisting that he had always acted in good faith, that he had sought the welfare of his subjects. But the verdict was inevitable. The revolution could not survive while the king lived. By a narrow vote, he was condemned to death. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, Paris awoke to the sound of drums. Soldiers filled the streets, lining the route from the Temple prison to the Place de la Révolution, where the guillotine loomed. The city was tense, fearful, expectant. Some hoped for mercy at the last moment. Others demanded blood. The king rode in a carriage, dressed simply, accompanied by priests. His face was pale, but calm. He gazed out the window at the silent crowds, knowing that centuries of monarchy ended with him. At around 10 in the morning, he arrived at the scaffold. The guillotine towered above, its blade gleaming in the cold winter light. Louis mounted the steps with steady tread. He attempted to speak, raising his voice above the drumbeats. "I die innocent of all the crimes laid to my charge," he declared. "I forgive those who have brought about my death, and I pray that my blood may not fall upon France." His words rang with clarity, but the drums rolled louder, drowning his voice. Perhaps it was deliberate. The revolutionaries did not wish the people to hear a king's final appeal. The executioners seized him. They bound his hands, laid him beneath the blade. He struggled briefly, then composed himself, his eyes lifting heavenward. At a signal, the blade fell. With a terrible crash, the head of Louis XVI was severed from his body. The executioner lifted it high for all to see. A great cry erupted, "Vive la République!" and the square shook with shouts of triumph. Some cheered wildly, others stood in stunned silence. The blood of the king dripped down the scaffold into the sawdust below. The king's body was taken away and thrown into an unmarked grave. Quicklime poured over the remains to hasten their decay. Months later, his queen would follow him to the guillotine, her beauty and dignity unable to save her from the same fate. Their young son, Louis Charles, died in prison, neglected and broken. The royal line was shattered, its glory consumed in the fire of revolution. The tragedy of Louis's death lies in its futility. He was not a tyrant who delighted in cruelty. He was not Nero, Caligula, or Ivan the Terrible. He was a hesitant man in a time that demanded decisiveness, a well-meaning king overwhelmed by forces beyond his control. His kindness could not save him. His weakness destroyed him. His death was necessary not because of his crimes, but because of what he represented, monarchy itself. History has judged him with pity more than hatred. Some see him as a martyr, a man who died with dignity and forgiveness on his lips. Others see him as the symbol of a decayed system that could no longer survive. But no one can deny the tragedy of his end. Dragged from his palace to a prison, from prison to a courtroom, from courtroom to a scaffold, he met death with calm courage, his final words drowned by the drumbeats of revolution. His execution marked a turning point in world history. No longer could kings claim that their crowns were sacred, untouchable. The people had shown that they could destroy monarchy itself. The blade of the guillotine became the symbol of equality, terrible and final. And the blood of Louis XVI became the seed from which a new France, and indeed a new world, was born. Among the tragic deaths of kings, his stands out not for cruelty, but for symbolism. He was the last king of France to believe in absolute monarchy, and the first to be destroyed by the will of the people. His end was not just the fall of a man, it was the fall of an age. Number 1. King Edward II of England. Few monarchs in European history suffered a fate as cruel, degrading, and infamous as King Edward II of England. His story is not one of great victories or noble reforms, but of weakness, humiliation, betrayal, and a death so horrifying that it became legend. Unlike kings who perished gloriously in battle or fell swiftly to an assassin's blade, Edward died alone in prison, subjected to torture so savage that chroniclers wrote of it in tones of horror. Whether all the gruesome details are fact or exaggeration hardly matters, for his reputation has forever been shaped by the tragedy of his fall. Edward was born in the year 1284, the fourth son of King Edward I, known as Longshanks, one of England's most formidable warrior kings. Edward I was a towering figure, ruthless in battle, relentless in conquest. He subjugated Wales, struck fear into Scotland, and ruled his kingdom with iron discipline. His son could not have been more different. Where the father was commanding and austere, the son was soft, impressionable, and indulgent. When Edward I died in 1307, his son inherited the throne. The expectations of the people were immense. They longed for a king who would continue the conquests of Longshanks, who would carry the English banner to triumph. Instead, they received a monarch more interested in festivals, music, and the company of his favorites than in the burdens of kingship. From the start, Edward alienated his nobles. He showered affection and power upon Piers Gaveston, a young Gascon knight whose closeness to the king provoked scandal. Gaveston was arrogant, mocking the great lords with insulting nicknames, flaunting his influence. The nobles seethed with resentment. Parliament demanded his exile. Edward resisted, clung to his companion, and only under threat of rebellion did he yield. Even then, Gaveston returned swiftly. Finally, the the barons took matters into their own hands. They captured Gaveston and executed him, beheading the king's beloved friend. Edward was devastated. His grief deepened his rift with the nobility, but he did not learn caution. Instead, he raised new favorites, the Despencer family, to positions of power. The Despensers were greedy and ruthless, using their closeness to the king to enrich themselves and punish enemies. Once again, the nobles rose in fury. England descended into conflict, with barons and king battling for supremacy. Meanwhile, Edward proved incompetent in war. In 1314, at the Battle of Bannockburn, he led a massive army into Scotland to crush Robert the Bruce. It was a disaster. The English forces, though far larger, were outmaneuvered and humiliated. Thousands were slain or captured. Edward himself barely escaped the battlefield. The defeat shattered English prestige and left Edward's reputation in ruins. At home, famine and unrest spread. His reliance on the Despensers deepened hatred. The king appeared incapable of governing, incapable of defending his realm, incapable even of controlling his own household. The final betrayal came from within. Queen Isabella of France, whom Edward had married in a political alliance, had long been neglected and humiliated by his favoritism. Intelligent and strong-willed, Isabella grew to despise her husband. In 1326, she allied with Roger Mortimer, a powerful nobleman, and her lover. Together, they invaded England with a small force. But Edward had lost the loyalty of his barons, his people, and even his household. One by one, his supporters abandoned him. The realm collapsed before Isabella's advance. Edward fled westward, clinging to the Despensers. In desperation, he sought refuge in Wales, but betrayal dogged him everywhere. He was captured, dragged back in chains, and brought before a parliament that no longer recognized his authority. In January 1327, Edward was formally deposed, the first English king forced to abdicate. His young son, barely 14 years old, was crowned Edward III. The former king, once ruler of England, was reduced to a prisoner. Imprisoned in Kenilworth, and later at Berkeley Castle, Edward languished in captivity. At first, his captors treated him with dignity, allowing some comforts, but his very existence was dangerous. So long as he lived, loyalists might rally to him, rebellions might erupt, and the fragile rule of Isabella and Mortimer might collapse. It was decided that Edward must die. Chroniclers describe his final night in words that echo with horror. They tell us that his jailers entered the cell with cruel intent. They sought to kill him, without leaving a mark of murder that might draw suspicion. According to one account, they thrust a red-hot iron into his body through a horn, burning him alive from within. The screams, it was said, echoed through the castle, so terrible that villagers miles away claimed to have heard them. Whether this precise method is fact or propaganda, the essence is undeniable. Edward died in torment, his body violated, his dignity destroyed. He was only 43 years old. His corpse was buried at Gloucester, where his tomb can still be seen. But the memory of his death spread swiftly across Europe, shocking even in an age accustomed to cruelty. Kings were meant to fall by the sword, not to perish in hidden chambers under instruments of torture. The tragedy of Edward II lies not only in his ghastly death, but in the utter collapse of his reign. He began as the son of a great conqueror, inheriting a strong and united realm. He squandered it through favoritism, incompetence, and weakness. He alienated his nobles, failed in war, and even lost the loyalty of his queen. When his time came, no one stood by him. Not a single army rose in his defense. Not a single great lord shielded him. He was abandoned utterly, left to die in agony at the hands of jailers who once bowed to him. Yet, as with all tragic kings, there is a kind of pathos in his story. He was not a monster like Richard III, nor a stubborn zealot like Charles I. He was not a tyrant like other despots of history. He was simply a man unfit to rule, a man who loved unwisely, who trusted unwisely, and who found himself crushed by the weight of the crown. His death was not just the end of a king. It was the spectacle of monarchy reduced to its most pitiful form. majesty tortured into misery, divinity degraded into dust. When later generations looked back upon his reign, they remembered not his policies, not his battles, but his death. The image of a king screaming in the night, flames consuming him from within, became a symbol of the darkest possibilities of royal downfall. It is this image, half history, half legend, that ensures his place at the top of this list. Among the tragic deaths of kings, none was more cruel, more humiliating, or more unforgettable than that of Edward II of England.